been quite a week, hasn't it? I wasn't sure this morning if I should speak about Israel or about Pesach, so I decided to speak about both. I admit that every time I sat down to write a few words to you, my congregation, about Israel in the past few weeks, every time I'd have a free moment to try and put my thoughts together, something would happen, and everything that I thought to write to you was immediately rendered irrelevant. And the situation has been changing so dramatically and so quickly that it's hard actually for me to catch up with my own thoughts and understanding of what's going on. And I was grateful this week to have the opportunity to learn with Dr. Micha Goodman, who's a scholar at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, head of a yeshiva in Prat, and he's a leading voice in Israel, and he helped me understand what's going on in a new way, and I want to share some of my own thoughts with you, largely influenced by his teachings. It also seems that Pesach, it's interesting in the Israeli calendar, Pesach is a little bit of a reprieve. It's people take a break for Pesach. The same way that Congress in America goes on break for the summer or for Christmas, in Israel, Pesach is a break. And so we have a little bit of a breathing room to understand what's happened and where we go from here. But first, a little bit of Pesach Torah, okay? As you know, Pesach is our holiday of liberation. It's a holiday of redemption. Year after year, we gather at our Seder tables to retell the story, to retell our history, but not just to tell the story of something that happened a long time ago, but to find our place in it. We seek to see ourselves as a part of an ongoing, unfolding story of liberation. In the Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Yoshua says the following. He says, Ben Nisan nig'alu, ben Nisan atidin ligael. In the month of Nisan, the month we're in right now, they were redeemed. And in the month of Nisan, we will be redeemed in the future. In Rabbi Yoshua's formulation, the Exodus from Egypt is a historical event that we celebrate, but it's also a blueprint for how a moment of crisis and despair can lead to redemption, now in our day and in the future. Pesach is not only about looking back to appreciate how far we've come. It's not only about gratitude for where we are right now, but it also expresses a hope for the future, a tikva, la'atid, and where we'd like to be as a people and as individuals. And as a Zionist, this framework takes on even more significance and meaning. In my family growing up, and indeed in my home today, we used to sing the last paragraph of the Haggadah to the tune of Hatikva. Chasal Sidor Pesach Kehilchato Leshana Haba Be'Yerushalayim Leshana Haba B'Yerushalayim Habnuya. With every somber and resolute note, we were affirming at our Seder table that the story of Pesach continues in our day, and that the modern state of Israel is part of that narrative. When we pray for Israel, as we did just a few moments ago, we say, Reshit Tzmichat Ge'ulatenu. Israel, the modern state, is the first flowering of our redemption. Israel is the first buds of spring that carry with them a promise of warmer days ahead and new life in the future. Now, this is a profound theological statement. It's easy to gloss over how significant it is that we've made that claim, that a modern state actually has some kind of theological significance for our ultimate redemption, that Israel, with all of its challenges, represents an important step towards the ultimate redemption. Now, some have been adding the word shetehe reshit tzmichat gulatenu, that Israel should become the first flowering of our redemption. Those who do that are saying Israel's not there yet, But Israel could yet be the first flowering of our redemption. I think either version of the prayer conveys a sense that the work is far from complete, but with Israel we have an opportunity to make this world a better place. And friends, Israel today is in one of the most dramatic moments in its history. There is a political crisis. There are deep divisions boiling over into mass protests. There is tremendous disruption in daily life in Israel. Last week they closed down the airports and the highways. Diplomats and military officials are resigning or going on strike in protest of the actions of the government. In Israel, in synagogues, and indeed around people's own family gatherings, people are getting into open fights about the differences they have over policies. Micha told me that at the Kiddush Club, he told us that at the Kiddush Club they have, some synagogues have like a Kiddush Club where people who don't want to sit in the service, they go to the back and they make a l'chaim. He says at the Kiddush Club, last Shabbat, a fight broke out, and it was so severe that people just left shul and went home. They couldn't stand to be in conversation with each other. They were so angry, so worked up over what's happening in Israel. Many are fearing for their seders this week because they're going to gather their families, and they know that people of different political persuasions are going to be gathered around the same table, and they're not going to be able to talk about it because it's too hot right now. They're afraid that it's going to tear apart their family bonds. I think many of us can relate to that. Many of us have had other experiences, whether about American politics or about Israel, where when you gather the family together, there are people of different stripes. And you got to figure out how to eat together when you have different opinions around the table. Israel is in a moment of deep crisis. And these divisions are concerning. They should be concerning to all of us. Micha reminded us that the Hebrew word for crisis is a word mashber. Has anyone ever heard that word, mashber? It's a modern Hebrew word, but it comes from the Bible. In modern Hebrew, it means crisis. The root of the word is shever, which comes from the meaning to break. Something has broken. But in the Bible, it has a particular context. In Malachim Bet, in 2 Kings, King Hezekiah says, Kiva'u banim ad mashber, v'koach en laleda. The children have reached mashber, and there is no strength left to give birth. He pointed out to us that the word mashber in this context is a place, or perhaps a moment where a child is about to be born. Some translate it as the birth stool. The children have arrived at the mashber, v'koach en laleda, and there's no strength left to give birth. In a pre-modern society, much as today, the moment right before birth is a moment of great precariousness. It's a moment of terror, of concern for the health of the mother and the health of the child. It's a moment pregnant with possibility, but also a moment of great trepidation. So Israel is in a moment of mashber, a moment of deep crisis. It's a moment where something has broken in Israeli society, but in the breaking, something new might be born, a new political agreement or a new social contract, or it could be a moment of destruction. That part of the story has not yet been written. What happened this week? Why did hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets and protest? Why is this crisis different from all other crises? Israel is not a stranger to crises. So what is happening today? Israelis are not strangers to disagreement or political argument. From its founding, they've had different ideas. What is happening today that is different? The difference is that this is not a disagreement over policy, but it's a disagreement over the fundamental way that Israel will function as a society. It's a disagreement about core values, about what Israel is and what it will become. You see, Israel does not have a constitution. It does have some basic laws which guide its governance, which the Supreme Court interprets, but it never ratified a constitution. Israel also lacks certain checks and balances, which are the hallmarks of American democracy. There's no federalism in Israel, which means that there's no state governments. The federal government is the government. It's not like New Jersey can make laws that govern our lives in a way that the federal government cannot. There's also no separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branches of government. Without a constitution, Israel has never had a clear understanding of the rules of the game. They've instead had de facto ways of governing and making policy. They've been playing the game, but they haven't fully established or codified all the rules. Perhaps this will be a helpful analogy. Baseball is back this week. I'm thrilled. But as you know, they changed some of the rules. Maybe you've heard about this. There's now a pitch clock. The bases are a little bigger. You can't do the shifts on the infield. Now, we could debate the new rules. But what's notable is that most of the time we play the game and we don't actually think about the rules. We just enjoy watching the game being played. Sometime my team wins. Most of the time my team loses. But we all agree that the bases are 90 feet apart. We all agree on the size of the baseball. Well, Israel has been playing a game in which those rules of the game have not been properly codified, which is why some people are concerned about the possibility of a constitutional crisis. I take it even a little further. When these rules changes, and by the way, this analogy falls apart at some point, so don't take it too far, but when Major League Baseball made the changes to the rules, it was Major League Baseball who decided what the rules were for all the teams. Imagine if the Yankees got to determine the rules for all of baseball. How do you think the Red Sox would feel about that? Let me translate it to the Israeli context. The Israeli populace has been moving steadily rightward for several decades now. And this has been reflected in the outcomes of elections. But at the same time, the Israeli Supreme Court has been increasing in its power to declare certain policies unconstitutional. Whenever a right-wing government seeks to do something that violates values of human dignity or civil rights, the Supreme Court has said, you can't do that. And this has frustrated the goals of the government. It's caused great distress in the right wing, and their grievance is legitimate. Even if you disagree with their perspective or their policies, you can understand their frustrations. A common refrain on the right has been, for decades now, Matzbiya yaminu mekabel smol. You vote for the right-wing parties, and what you get are left-wing policies. And they've placed a lot of the blame for that at the foot of the Supreme Court. I could get into some of the particulars, but it would take all day, about why that shift in Israeli demographics and politics has led to this right-wing government, about how the Supreme Court functions, but that's not really for today. What I want you to know is that this has been a frustration of the right. And it's also a problem for democracy. You see, people who seek empowerment through elections and through government, they should not be persistently thwarted, or they will soon do something radical or drastic to express their frustrations. Most Israelis agree that some reform of the judiciary is necessary. So why are so many from the left, the right, and the center protesting? If everyone agrees that some reform is necessary, what is the big deal? Well, you see, this government didn't introduce incremental reforms. They introduced radical changes, which would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Israeli government. They're trying to change the rules of the game. This is what this moment that we're in, which is when people are protesting and people are trying to advocate for some change to the rules of the game and they can't agree on what it is. It's what constitutional scholar Bruce Ackerman calls a constitutional moment. Everyone agrees in Israeli society that something needs to change. These moments are rare. doesn't come up often that we see there's a fundamental problem in our system of governance, and we need to make a change. America had that moment at its founding, and they had a constitutional convention, and they got consensus from the states. They ratified the Constitution. And at different points in America's history, when we've realized, wait a second, there's a problem with that Constitution, we've ratified amendments. Women were left out of the initial Constitution. Enslaved peoples were left out. Well, we can revisit. Those are constitutional moments. A moment where we say we're going to change the rules of the game to reflect an evolving understanding of society. Israel, at this moment, is in a constitutional moment. And if the government moves forward with these fundamental changes without compromise, without consensus, well, Israel will be altered, and it will give vast power and authority to the government without checks that could have dramatic impacts and would make Israel fundamentally different. It could have impacts on human rights, on minorities' rights, on women's rights, on LGBTQ rights. It could possibly have dramatic economic impact, as many tech leaders are threatening to move their businesses abroad. It could also have security implications, since so many military leaders are morally opposed to this government and its actions. Hundreds of pilots and reservists signed a letter saying their oath was to protect and defend the Jewish and democratic state. And the moves by this government have threatened that democracy. And they would follow their hearts and their oath, their moral compass, rather than follow orders of the government. If these changes pass, they argue, they cannot serve in good conscience, so they're not reporting for duty. And this was what ultimately pushed Defense Minister Yoav Gallant this week to defect, because he felt that this approach to change in Israeli governance, well, this jeopardized Israel's security and readiness, something Israel cannot afford to do. And this is what led hundreds of thousands of Israelis to the streets to call for a pause. Let's take a breath and figure this out. So the changes are on hold, but there's no resolution to the fundamental conflict. It's only a delay. This is a true mashper. Israel is a divided society, which is why they've had so many elections in recent years. They are divided on what the country should be. And Micha Goodman said this moment could be the beginning of the end for Israel. Or it could be the end of the beginning. And he unpacked that for us. If it's the beginning of the end, this crisis will consume Israel, and it will be destroyed. At least the Israel that we knew and loved will be so different that it won't exist in the same way that it has before. And Israel will have been destroyed this time not by enemies from without, but by disagreement from within. Our rabbis 2,000 years ago taught that our temple was destroyed not because of the Romans, but because of internal divisions and strife within the Jewish people, because of sinat chinam, because of senseless hatred for a Jew against Jew. They recognize that when we are united, when we agree to be together and work out our differences amongst ourselves, well, no enemy can defeat us. But when we are divided, well, then we are vulnerable to destruction. Israel is a divided society, which means we are in a moment of mashper, a moment of crisis, and they have to figure out how to compromise and work things out, or this will be the beginning of the end. Israel may still exist, but it will be so changed that many in Israel will choose to leave, and I'm afraid a good portion of North American Jews will wash their hands of it as well. That, heaven forbid, would be the end of Israel as we know it. But it could also be the end of the beginning, which is to say that for 75 years, Israel didn't have a constitution. And now this moment of crisis could be that constitutional moment, that catalyst for bringing parties to the table, that opportunity for ending Israel's infancy and agreeing on the rules of the game that will define its future. But it's going to require a great deal of political will and leadership, a willingness to compromise, And all of that pressure falls on the shoulders of poor President Bougie Herzog, who's trying to negotiate compromise between the different sides and is having a really hard time doing it. But for now, things are on pause. We get a little break for Pesach. Israeli Jews like us are going to gather this week around their Seder tables, and perhaps, I wonder if the answer to this crisis lies in that very act, in getting together around the Seder table and sharing a meal together. You see, when we celebrate Pesach, everyone has a seat at the Seder table. Not everyone agrees. I don't know if your Seder is like mine, but it's pretty clear that not everyone agrees around the table. But everyone's voices and objections are heard, are processed, and we don't eat until we discuss. Every protest, even those of the Rasha, even those of the rebellious child, is given voice. Everyone is welcome. We share wine and matzah. We break bread in quotes. We break bread together. We discuss together. We learn how to live together. The original Pesach Mashber, the original Passover crisis, was not the end of our story, but the beginning of year after year of discussing that story together and adding new chapters to that story with each generation. We didn't stay in Mitzrayim. We didn't stay in Egypt. We crossed a split sea, and we birthed a new future for our people. We wandered in the wilderness. We stood at Mount Sinai. We established a covenant of how we were going to relate to God and to each other, an agreement that binds us together as a people. We need a way to make that covenant alive again today. When your Passover Seder ends, I can guarantee you that not everyone will agree. But I hope also you'll agree with me that we feel better when we got to share Pesach together. So my prayer this Pesach is simply this. This year, may we enjoy sharing our Passover tables together. And next year, may we be privileged to celebrate in a rebuilt Jerusalem together. Shabbat Shalom. Please rise, page 368.